It all kicked off in Albany, New York, where I was living, working as a web developer, and not really keeping up with my sister Liv's romantic adventures. She always fell in love fast, and her boyfriends came and went so quickly that I stopped bothering to remember their names. Liv, 2 years older than me, was a florist and loved hosting family get-togethers to show off her latest, perfect guy. I was used to these dinners, but I never expected much from them. That evening, Liv called me, her voice practically bursting with excitement. She begged me to come over for dinner to meet someone she said was special. I sighed, figuring it was just another guy who'd vanish in a couple of months, but I agreed because arguing with Liv was pointless. When I got to her small apartment in downtown Albany, she greeted me with a beaming smile, and there he was, Gabriel. Tall, with an athletic build, he stood out right away. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his warm smile made me feel oddly at ease. Liv introduced us, barely containing her joy, and I shook his hand, noticing a firm, confident grip. Gabriel was a social worker, helping families in tough situations, and his quiet confidence filled the room. We sat down to eat, and Liv started telling the story of how they met at a local flower market. I listened half-heartedly, but I couldn't help noticing how Gabriel watched her every word, nodding with a gentle smile. He wasn't like the arrogant guys Liv used to bring around. When she stepped into the kitchen to grab some wine, Gabriel turned to me and asked what I did for a living. I told him about my work with websites, expecting him to just nod, but he asked a few questions that showed he was genuinely curious. It was surprisingly nice. We kept chatting and I found myself laughing at his stories. He shared how he once mixed up clients' names at a meeting and had to apologize to an entire family for the confusion. Liv came back, thrilled that we were hitting it off. I tried not to stare at Gabriel too long, but his gaze, warm and attentive, made my heart beat a little faster. When dinner wrapped up, I said goodbye, but his smile stuck with me as I walked home under Albany's chilly November sky. I told myself he was just a friendly guy, nothing more. But deep down, I felt this meeting was the start of something I couldn't predict. After that dinner at Liv's apartment, I tried to push Gabriel out of my mind, but it was harder than I expected. His smile, his calm voice, the way he looked at me like he genuinely cared about what I was thinking, it all stuck with me. I told myself it was silly, that he was just my sister's boyfriend, and I needed to focus on my own life. I spent my days working on websites for clients, holed up in my small Albany apartment, but thoughts of Gabriel kept creeping in like uninvited guests. A few days after the dinner, my phone buzzed, and I saw a message from him. He'd sent a link to an article about web design with a short note. Thought you might find this interesting. I smiled, despite myself, and texted back, thanking him for the find. That's how our texting started. At first, the messages were sporadic. He'd send a joke or ask how I was doing, and I'd reply with something neutral, trying not to cross any lines. But soon, we were texting almost every day. Gabriel shared stories about his work as a social worker, telling me about helping families find housing or navigate tough times. I'd vent about picky clients or share ideas for new projects. Liv didn't suspect a thing and even seemed thrilled that Gabriel and I were getting along so well. One day over coffee, she said she loved seeing her boyfriend and her brother become friends. I nodded, feeling a pang of guilt because I knew my thoughts about Gabriel weren't exactly innocent anymore. One afternoon, I ran into him by chance in downtown Albany, near a bookstore where I like to hang out. I was flipping through a coding book when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Gabriel was standing there, holding a collection of historical essays, smiling like we'd planned to meet. He suggested grabbing coffee, and I, unable to come up with an excuse, agreed. We sat in a small cafe, the air filled with the scent of fresh espresso, and talked about everything, from favorite books to how he dreamed of visiting Italy someday. His eyes lit up when he talked about his plans, and I caught myself staring at him longer than I should have. At one point, our hands brushed when we both reached for the sugar, and I felt the warmth of his skin linger on my fingers. I pulled my hand back quickly, pretending nothing happened, but my heart was pounding so loud I worried he could hear it. When we said goodbye, Gabriel suggested we hang out again to watch a new documentary I'd mentioned. I agreed, even though I knew it was risky territory. Liv kept encouraging us to bond, unaware that every conversation, every glance, was pulling us closer to something I couldn't control. I walked home, a mix of excitement and fear growing inside me. Gabriel was becoming a part of my life, and I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. I couldn't stop thinking about Gabriel after our coffee shop run-in, and it was starting to scare me. His voice, his laugh, the way his fingers brushed mine by accident, it all played on repeat in my head while I tried to focus on work in my Albany apartment. I told myself to keep my distance, that he was Liv's boyfriend, and any thoughts about him were a mistake. But every time my phone buzzed and I saw his name, my heart skipped a beat. Our texts were getting longer, warmer, and I caught myself waiting for his messages like some lovesick teenager. Liv kept gushing about our friendship, even suggesting we go to a movie together, thinking it would strengthen our bond. I agreed, even though I knew it was a terrible idea. That evening, Liv got stuck at work, putting together a big wedding order, and Gabriel and I ended up alone in her apartment. She'd insisted he come over, saying I'd keep him company. When I opened the door, Gabriel stood there, holding a couple of beers, with that smile that made my breath catch. We settled on the couch, put on some documentary about travel, but I could barely follow the plot. My attention was on him. The way he sat just a little too close, the way his knee brushed mine, sending a wave of heat through me. We talked about music, how he loved old jazz, and I shared how I'd tried learning guitar once but quit after 2 lessons. He laughed, and his laugh was so low, so alive, that it sent goosebumps across my skin. At some point, the conversation slowed, turning quieter, more personal. Gabriel asked what I dreamed about, and without thinking, I started talking about wanting to open my own web design studio someday. His eyes, dark and focused, stayed on me, and I felt the air between us thicken. He leaned in a bit to set his beer on the table, and his shoulder pressed against mine. I froze, feeling his warmth seep through my shirt, his faint breath grazing my cheek. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I turned to him and our eyes locked, too long, too dangerous. His hand, resting on the couch, inched closer, and his fingers brushed mine, so lightly but enough to make my pulse race. It was like a spark, soft but electric, and I didn't pull away. We didn't speak, but the silence was louder than any words. His thumb traced slowly over my wrist, and I felt heat creeping up my neck. I knew I should move, say something to break the moment, but instead, I leaned in a little closer, breathing in his scent, a mix of beer and something sharp, uniquely him. Gabriel's gaze held mine, his breathing a little heavier now, and I could see his chest rising and falling. But then he pulled back suddenly, muttering something about it getting late, and stood up, like he was trying to escape what had just happened. I nodded, mumbling that it was fine, but inside, I was burning. When he left, I sat there on the couch, still feeling his touch on my skin, knowing we just crossed a line we weren't supposed to cross. I couldn't shake the memory of that evening on the couch with Gabriel, and it was driving me crazy. His touch, his breath, the way his gaze lingered on me too long, it haunted me while I tried to go about my normal life in Albany. I told myself we had to stop, that it was wrong, that Liv didn't deserve this kind of betrayal. But every time his message popped up, I couldn't help but reply. Our texts got shorter but heavier, like we both knew we were teetering on the edge of something dangerous. Liv still thought we were just friends, even encouraging us to hang out, oblivious to how hard I was fighting to keep myself in check. One night, Gabriel texted, saying he needed to talk and asked if he could come over. I knew I should have said no, but the thought of seeing him again overpowered any rational argument. When I opened my apartment door, he was there, in a dark jacket, looking tired but with a spark in his eyes that made my heart race. He stepped inside, and we sat at my kitchen table, each holding a beer, but the conversation felt forced. I could feel the air between us thickening, his every glance cutting through me like a blade. He started talking about work, some tough case with a family, but his voice wavered, and I could tell he was as distracted as I was. At one point, I got up to grab another beer, and he followed me to the fridge. We were too close, and I felt the heat of his body just a step away. My breathing hitched, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the bottle. Gabriel was watching me, his eyes darker than usual, his lips slightly parted like he wanted to say something but couldn't. I turned to him and time seemed to slow. His hand rose slowly, brushing my shoulder, his fingers trailing down my arm, leaving a burning path on my skin. I didn't move, didn't breathe, feeling his touch stir something deep inside me, almost uncontrollable. He stepped closer, and I felt his breath on my neck, warm and slightly uneven. My fingers reached for his jacket, gripping the fabric like it could anchor me from falling into this abyss. Our faces were so close I could smell his skin, a mix of soap and something sharp, uniquely him. His lips brushed mine, tentative at first, like he was testing if I'd push him away. But I didn't. I leaned in, kissing him back, and the kiss turned deeper, hungrier, full of everything we'd been holding back. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me against him, his fingers digging in like he was afraid I'd vanish. My body was on fire, every touch sending waves of heat through me, and I pressed closer, forgetting everything but this moment. Then he pulled back, his breathing ragged, his eyes full of confusion. He muttered that this was a mistake, that we couldn't keep doing this, and practically bolted out of the apartment, leaving me alone. I stood there, still tasting him on my lips, knowing we'd just taken a step we couldn't undo. After that kiss in my apartment, it felt like the world around me had shifted for good. Gabriel said it was a mistake, but his words couldn't erase the feeling of his lips on mine, his hands gripping me tightly, or the way my body responded to every single touch. I tried to go back to my normal life in Albany, working on websites and avoiding Liv because every look from her reminded me of what I was hiding. But Gabriel didn't vanish from my life. His texts started coming again, careful but carrying that same warmth I couldn't ignore. We both knew we should stop, but neither of us did. Liv kept believing we were just friends, even praising Gabriel for fitting in with our family, completely unaware that every conversation we had was laced with something forbidden. One night, when Liv was away for a weekend floristry workshop, Gabriel texted, asking if he could stop by. I knew it was risky, but the thought of feeling him close again overpowered any doubts. When he showed up at my apartment, his eyes held that same mix of confusion I'd seen before, but now there was something else, determination mixed with want. We sat on the couch, and I put on some music to fill the awkward silence, but it only heightened the tension. Gabriel was so close I could feel the heat of his thigh through his jeans, and every breath he took seemed louder than the melody in the background. We talked about nothing important, the weather, his work, but the words were just a cover for what we both felt. Then he went quiet, and his hand settled over mine, his fingers lacing with mine, sending a rush of heat through my entire body. I looked at him, and his gaze was so heavy, so full of need, that I could barely breathe. He leaned in, and his lips met mine, but this time there was no hesitation. The kiss was deep, demanding, like he was trying to say everything he couldn't put into words. My hands slid across his chest, feeling the firmness of his body under his shirt, and I pulled him closer, sensing his heartbeat matching mine. His fingers tangled in my hair, tugging gently, and I let out a soft breath, sinking into the feeling. He pressed me back against the couch, his body so solid, so real, that I forgot everything, Liv, the guilt, the consequences. His lips moved to my neck, leaving a trail of warmth, and I tilted my head, giving him more space, feeling his breath burn against my skin. My hands found the hem of his shirt, tugging at the fabric, wanting to feel his warmth without barriers. We moved in a feverish rhythm, every touch a mix of tenderness and desperate need. But then he froze, his forehead resting against my shoulder, his breathing uneven. He whispered that we had to be more careful, that we couldn't let this spiral out of control. I nodded, but deep down I knew it was already too late. When he left, I lay on the couch, still smelling him, realizing this secret was binding us tighter than I could have ever imagined. Our secret meetings with Gabriel became my new reality, and I lived in constant tension, torn between euphoria and crushing guilt. Every time we were alone, I promised myself it would be the last time, but his presence shattered all my resolve. His touch, his voice, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the room, it was like an addiction I couldn't quit. We met in stolen moments, when Liv was busy at work or out of Albany, and every second with him was soaked in something both beautiful and destructive. I avoided long talks with Liv because I was terrified she'd see the truth in my eyes. She still thought Gabriel and I were just close friends, and her smile when she talked about him cut me like a knife. One evening, Gabriel showed up at my place after a particularly rough day. He looked exhausted, his shoulders tense, his eyes heavy with worry. We sat on my bed, and I put on soft music to drown out the silence that was getting too loud. He talked about a tough case at work, but I could tell his mind was elsewhere. I touched his hand, trying to comfort him, and his fingers gripped mine instantly, like he was grasping for an anchor. We locked eyes, and the air between us felt almost solid. He leaned in, and his lips met mine, soft but with that urgency that made my heart race. I pulled him closer, feeling the heat of his body, the firmness of his chest under his thin t-shirt. My hands slipped under the fabric, grazing his smooth, warm skin, and he let out a quiet breath as my fingers traced along his back. He pressed me down onto the bed, his knees sliding between my legs, and I felt his breath, hot and uneven, against my neck. His lips moved slowly, exploring my skin, and I arched into him, every touch igniting a fire inside me. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling his face back to mine, kissing him like it was our last chance. His hands slid to my hips, gripping them with a strength that nearly drew a moan from me. We were so close, so consumed by each other, that the world outside ceased to exist. But somewhere deep in my mind, I knew this couldn't last forever. And it didn't. The next day, Liv called me, her voice trembling with pain. She'd found out, Gabriel had confessed, unable to keep lying. I went to her apartment, and when I saw her, my heart sank. Her eyes were red from crying, her face a mask of betrayal. She shouted, asking how I could do this, how I could betray her, my own sister. Gabriel stood in the corner, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. I tried to explain, but the words stuck in my throat. Liv threw us both out, and I left, feeling the ground crumble beneath me. Gabriel looked at me, his eyes full of pain, but he said nothing. We walked away from each other, and I knew that everything we'd had just tore my family apart. After Liv kicked us out of her apartment, my life in Albany turned into an empty shell. It felt like I'd lost not just my sister, but a piece of myself. Gabriel vanished from my world. No texts, no calls, just a silence that weighed heavier than any guilt. I tried to drown my thoughts in work, staying up late coding in my small apartment, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. His face, his hands, his breath that still felt so real to me. What happened between us was wrong, but I couldn't deny how much it changed me. Liv wouldn't answer my calls, and I didn't dare show up at her place, knowing my words couldn't erase the pain I'd caused her. Her betrayal was my biggest failure, but the thought of Gabriel kept burning in me like an unhealed wound. One night, unable to stay home, I went to a bar in downtown Albany, hoping to numb my thoughts with alcohol. I was sitting at the counter, sipping whiskey, when I felt an odd sensation, like someone was watching me. I turned and saw Gabriel standing in the far corner, holding a beer. His eyes met mine, and for a second, the bar's noise faded away. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, but there was something in his gaze that made my heart tighten. I didn't know what to do, but he walked over slowly, and we were face to face for the first time since that awful day. He asked if he could sit, and I nodded, feeling my body tense from his closeness. We talked about nothing important, the weather, work, but every word was heavy with what we couldn't say out loud. He was so close I could feel the warmth of his hand resting on the counter near mine. At one point, his knee brushed mine under the table, and a familiar heat shot up my spine. I looked at him, and his eyes, dark and full of longing, held me like a magnet. He leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping low, and I caught the scent of his cologne mixed with something that was just him. My fingers moved to his hand without thinking, grazing his wrist, and his skin was so warm, so familiar, that I barely stopped myself from pulling him close right there. We left the bar together, and the cold Albany night air couldn't cool the fire burning between us. We stood by my car, and he stepped toward me, his breath visible in the chill. His hand touched my face, his thumb tracing slowly along my cheek, and I closed my eyes, feeling his closeness melt away all my doubts. His lips were so near I could feel their warmth, but he stopped, his voice shaking as he said he couldn't keep living like this, that it was tearing him apart. I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. We stood in silence, and I realized this moment was our goodbye. When he walked away, I was left alone, still feeling his touch, knowing this encounter only deepened my pain. The months after that bar encounter dragged on slowly, and I felt like I was stuck in an endless fog. Albany, with its gray streets and cold winds, became a cage where I couldn't escape my thoughts about Gabriel and Liv. I tried to move on, throwing myself into new web projects, but every night, coming back to my empty apartment, I felt his absence. Liv never responded to my attempts to reach out, and I stopped hoping she'd forgive me. The guilt of destroying our family was heavier than I could bear, but deep down, I still missed Gabriel. His voice, his warmth, the way he made me feel alive. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop those thoughts. One day, I decided to get out of Albany for the weekend to clear my head. I bought a bus ticket to Rochester, New York, thinking a walk in a new city might help me shake the emptiness. On Saturday evening, I wandered through lively streets, popping into cafes and bookstores, trying to drown out the void inside me. I stopped at a small park where live music was playing, watching people dance under string lights. And then I saw him. Gabriel was standing across the street, alone, holding a coffee cup, gazing at the crowd. His hair was a bit longer, his face looked tired, but his presence still made my heart skip a beat. I froze, unsure whether to approach or leave, but he saw me. His eyes widened, and he walked toward me slowly. We stood face to face, and the air between us was as heavy as those nights when we couldn't keep our hands off each other. He asked how I was, and I mumbled something vague, feeling his voice cut through me. We sat on a bench, and he told me he'd moved to Rochester to start fresh, away from Albany's memories. His words were careful, but every glance said more than he dared to speak. I noticed his fingers nervously gripping his cup, and I remembered how those same fingers traced my skin, leaving marks I could still feel. I leaned in a little closer, breathing in his familiar scent, a mix of coffee and something that was just him. My body reacted instantly, and I saw his breath hitch slightly when our knees brushed. I wanted to touch him, to pull him close, but instead, we just talked, about the past, about how everything had changed. But then he said something I didn't expect. He confessed he'd met someone new, someone who was helping him move on. My heart sank, but I forced a smile, saying I was happy for him. He looked at me, his eyes full of pain, and whispered that he'd never forget what we had. We stood, and he hugged me, brief but so tight I felt his heartbeat. Then he walked away, disappearing into the crowd, and I was left alone, knowing this was our true end. But here's what I want to ask you, friends. Do you think I did the right thing by letting him go? Is it worth fighting for a love that tears everything apart? Or is it better to walk away to start over? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I really want to hear what you do in my shoes.